Welcome to America Joins the Great War, Part 1, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. Have you ever heard of the Great War? Even if you haven't, you've probably heard of World War I, and you might know some things about it already. Those two conflicts are one and the same. Before there was a Second World War with which to compare it, World War I was simply known as the Great War. The war was great in the destruction it caused and the changes it brought to our world. In this two-part tutorial, you'll learn how and why World War I began in Europe in 1914, and which nations formed the opposing sides, the Allied powers and the Central Powers. Then you'll learn how President Woodrow Wilson guided the United States on a neutral course for the first few years of the war, despite its closeness with the Allies. You'll learn about Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare and its sinking of the Lusitania, actions that made it difficult for the U.S. to maintain its neutrality. And you'll learn how the events of early 1917 led the United States to declare war against Germany and join the Allies in the Great War. Ready? Let's begin. In Europe, the summer of 1914 brought beautiful, glorious weather. Europe had been at relative peace for decades, and there had not been a truly major continental war since the Napoleonic Wars had ended in 1815. Trade and technology now connected the world's nations like never before. The idea of world war seemed ridiculous and suicidal to sophisticated Europeans of the 20th century. Europe contained far fewer nations than it does today. Instead, a few major empires dominated the continent. Great Britain and its empire ruled the seas, with the world's largest and most powerful navy. By most measures, Britain was still considered the world's leading superpower in 1914. To its south was France, Britain's traditional enemy but recent ally. To France's east was the recently united German Empire, the fastest growing and most powerful force on the European continent. The neighboring empire of Austria-Hungary included various ethnic groups including Poles, Czechs, Bosnians, and Serbs. And the vast Russian Empire to the east still remained undeveloped and agricultural compared to the rest of Europe. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, visited the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, in the southeastern region of his empire known as the Balkans. Although Sarajevo was part of Austria-Hungary, many Serbs and Bosnians who lived in the region wanted to split off from the empire and join with the neighboring kingdom of Serbia. 6 assassins, part of a group known as the Black Hand, planned to draw attention to their cause by murdering Franz Ferdinand. As the Archduke and his wife traveled in a motorcade through the streets of Sarajevo on June 28th, they were shot dead by one of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip. Outraged, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia the next month. What followed probably should have remained a small, local war in one of Europe's backwaters. However, unknown to most Europeans, an elaborate system of alliances among the continent's major powers, many of them stretching back decades, caused the conflict to explode into something vastly more dangerous. Russia was compelled to back the Serbs if they were attacked, so Russia mobilized its army against Austria-Hungary. Germany was obligated to back its ally, Austria-Hungary, and so declared war on Russia and on France, Russia's ally. When Germany invaded neutral Belgium in order to attack France, Britain's alliance with France and Belgium led it to declare war on Germany. Like the falling of dominoes, by the end of August 1914, Europe, and soon the world, was at war. The assassination of one man sparked what would become the most transformative event of the 20th century. Why did it happen? How did Europe descend so quickly from peace into war after the murder of a minor political figure? It's easy looking back to see some of the underlying threads that had set the stage for conflict. Sometimes these are referred to as the main causes of World War I: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Click on each of the causes to learn more about them. Militarism. Although Europe had enjoyed a century of relative peace, its nations were constantly preparing for war and expanding the size of their militaries, a trend known as militarism. From 1870 to 1914, European military spending had grown by an enormous 300%. Most nations required conscription, a draft, even in peacetime, just in case war broke out. The greatest military rivalry before the war was between Great Britain, which had the world's largest navy, and Germany, which built its own battleships in an attempt to compete with the British at sea. The arms race between these two empires made it more likely that war would occur. Alliances. You've already learned about the system of alliances that dragged the major powers of Europe into war with one another. You might not know that many of these alliances were made in secret, making it impossible for one nation to know where a declaration of war against another nation might end or what it might trigger. As far back as 1882, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy had formed a secret agreement called the Triple Alliance, each vowing to defend the others if attacked by France. In 1907, France joined with Russia and Great Britain to form the Triple Entente, a defensive alliance to guard against German aggression. Other smaller alliances and guarantees of security, like Russia's to Serbia or Britain's to Belgium, made it possible for an incident like Franz Ferdinand's murder to trigger a chain reaction leading to war. Imperialism. In 1914, the nations of Europe embraced imperialism and controlled much of the rest of the world in the form of colonies and territories. Even the United States had acquired its own small empire after winning the Spanish-American War in 1898. Imperialism meant competition, as empires competed for resources and land not just in Europe but across the globe. Germany, which had only recently unified as a single nation, lagged behind Britain, France, and Russia, and the other major imperial powers. As a result, Germans claimed whatever territories they could in Africa and the South Pacific. Wherever nations competed for colonies and resources around the world, imperialism led to new rivalries and conflicts. Nationalism. The term nationalism has several meanings. One trend of the late 19th century had been for smaller states to join together and form larger unified nations that united people with a common language and culture. Germany and Italy had both followed this nationalistic path. The same spirit had led Serbian nationalists in Austria-Hungary to desire unification with fellow Serbs and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Nationalism can also mean a kind of unhealthy patriotism, the belief that loyalty to one's own nation and opposition to other nations is more important than anything else. This belief would lead millions to die in World War I for little more than the abstract belief that their nation was superior to its rivals. The First World War began in August 1914. The alliance system you've learned about led the nations and empires of Europe to form two main sides, the Allied powers and the Central powers. The Allies originally consisted of Great Britain, France, and Russia. The three empires had been joined by an alliance called the Triple Entente. Japan joined the Allies almost immediately by declaring war on Germany, seizing the opportunity to take German territories in the Pacific. This turned the conflict into a world war. Italy also joined the Allies in the second year of the war after a brief period of neutrality. The Central Powers originally consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and as of November 1914, the Ottoman Empire. This empire consisted of Turkey and much of the Arabian Peninsula. Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in the second year of the war. On this map, the Allied powers can be seen in green, and the Central Powers and their conquered territories can be seen in orange. Almost everyone involved expected the war to be over by Christmas. Germany made a bold attack into France, following a strategy called the Schlieffen Plan, which involved invading neutral Belgium as a shortcut into France. If the plan had worked, the Germans might have defeated the French in the west before the British had a chance to fully mobilize, and then turned toward the east to deal with the Russians. Instead, the German offense bogged down in Belgium and northeast France, unable to achieve a breakthrough against the defenders' massive armies. By November, after the First Battle of Ypres ended indecisively, resulting in over 100,000 casualties, any hope for a quick end to the war vanished. Instead, the war along the Western Front, a line of combat stretching from Belgium down to the German border, settled into defensive trench warfare. The destruction and loss of life of the opening months of World War I stunned all of humanity. In the first unsuccessful months of the war, France lost as many as 850,000 men, killed or wounded. Germany lost as many as 670,000. Europe's beautiful landscapes were bombed and shelled into ravaged wastelands. And for years, neither side would be able to achieve a breakthrough. The Allies and the Central Powers were too evenly matched, and the modern weapons of war too deadly for either side to win. Over the next 4 years, as many as 10 million soldiers would die, an entire generation of young men. You may have noticed that we've barely mentioned the United States so far. What role did this nation play when World War I began? What side was the USA on? When war broke out in Europe, President Woodrow Wilson immediately declared that it was a European conflict that did not and should not involve Americans. "I thank heaven for the Atlantic Ocean," he remarked. Wilson said the U.S. would remain neutral and, as such, would continue normal relations and trade with all the warring nations, Allied and Central Powers. The president assumed that as a neutral power, the U.S. would continue to enjoy all the rights of neutral states during wartime. Specifically, he believed America should be able to continue sending its ships freely and safely across the seas without being attacked. He also insisted that American citizens should have safe passage even on the ships of belligerent states, those at war. Two things were at stake for the president. The first was an abstract principle, the rights of neutrals during wartime. The second was an economic issue. Beginning in 1913, America had experienced a recession during which industrial production and incomes had both declined. To prevent the recession from worsening or becoming a full-fledged depression, Wilson believed it was crucial that America's normal flow of trade with Europe not be disputed. This proved to be unrealistic. World War I was fought not only on land but also at sea. Great Britain had a powerful fleet that it used during the war primarily to blockade Germany's navy and ports. The point of the blockade was to stop Germany's trade with other nations and hopefully starve the Germans out by denying them food and supplies. The U.S. protested the blockade, which violated the international laws of the time because it meant that Americans were being denied their neutral rights to trade with Germany. But the U.S. ultimately went along with it and compensated for the lack of German trade by greatly expanding trade with Britain. War-related exports from the United States increased by about 400% from 1914 to 1917 as Americans sold the British food, clothing, weapons, and raw supplies they used to fight the Germans. This trade helped the U.S. economy and ended the recession. From Germany's point of view, the U.S. was not being neutral in accepting Britain's blockade and increasing trade with the Allies. From this point on, Germany and the Central Powers would grow more alienated from the United States. Germany had a powerful card of its own to play when it came to naval warfare. The Germans entered the war with a fleet of Unterseebooten, or U-boats, submarines, that they used to strike back against the British and their blockade. 48 were in service or under construction when the war began. Subs were a terrifying new technology, and they changed the rules of naval warfare. Prowling under the sea with only a periscope to see above the surface, U-boats launched surprise attacks on larger ships with their guns and torpedoes. But subs were also vulnerable to enemy attack if they were detected. Traditional warships like destroyers could easily sink them if they spotted them. Because of this, subs could not make themselves known before an attack. They struck without warning, and because of their small size, were unable to pick up or aid survivors from the ships they sank. This broke the long-standing traditions of naval warfare, which held that if a ship intended to sink another, it was supposed to give the enemy notice to abandon ship and time to get passengers and crew to safety first. If a U-boat did that, of course, it would give up its one advantage, the element of surprise, and would probably be sunk itself. The British, the main target of German submarine warfare, called it barbaric and uncivilized, but it was very effective. U-boats sank Allied shipping at an alarming rate. On one day in September 1914, a single German sub, U-9, sank 3 British warships in a single hour. More than 1,000 sailors went down with their ships and died. In February 1915, Germany's Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II declared all of the waters around Great Britain and Ireland to be a war zone. This was in retaliation for Britain's blockade of Germany. U-boat captains were given permission to sink any ships, even neutral vessels that sailed there. Germany justified this policy because British ships sometimes flew neutral flags as a trick to avoid being targeted by subs. The government of the United States declared Germany's new policy to be an indefensible violation of neutral rights. American ships and passengers regularly traveled through this war zone on their way to and from Britain, and the U.S. promised strict accountability if American lives or property were lost. When the war began, President Wilson acknowledged the difficulty of remaining neutral when, as he put it in a public address, the people of the United States are drawn from many nations and chiefly from the nations now at war. More privately, Wilson was determined to keep a lid on ethnic tensions that might split the American people apart. "We definitely have to be neutral," he told Germany's ambassador to the U.S., "since otherwise our mixed populations would wage war on each other." German Americans, for example, represented the largest ethnic subgroup in the nation, about 8 million people at the time. Naturally, many had sympathy for the home of their ancestors and hoped to see Germany win. But Wilson warned Americans that we must be impartial in thought as well as action. In other words, the president told Americans he expected them not to even pick favorites, let alone join sides in Europe's war. No one actually expected the American people to remain neutral in thought, and in fact, the president himself had strong sympathy for the position of Great Britain, France, and the Allies. Britain and the U.S. shared a common culture, language, and history, and France was America's oldest ally, having helped it win its independence at the end of the 18th century. The U.S. had experienced diplomatic ups and downs with both nations, but they were natural friends in a way that Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were not. Another factor attracted most Americans to the cause of Britain and the Allies, the idea of liberty. The German Empire was a militaristic society ruled by a strong monarch, the Kaiser Wilhelm II. Germany's culture in the early 20th century, unlike that of France, Britain, or the U.S., did not place a strong emphasis on democracy and the rights of the individual. Once the war began, the American public was fed a steady diet of Allied propaganda depicting Germans as barbaric Huns and their Kaiser as the Beast of Berlin, a madman bent on conquering the world. It didn't help Germany's reputation that when its army had invaded Belgium in 1914, German soldiers had ruthlessly killed many civilians and needlessly destroyed property. Even more horrible rumors circulated that Germans had stabbed Belgian babies with their bayonets for sport, or even eaten them. While this was almost certainly untrue, many Americans were quick to believe the propaganda, spread by the British, that portrayed Germans as the merciless enemies of civilization. So, although the American people strongly wished to stay out of the Great War themselves, the majority definitely leaned toward helping the Allies achieve victory over the Central Powers.